we need to be very aware of not boasting in the things that we are inclined to see as great achievements of our society.
Right.
Which, of course, is often the very first thing people do, saying, here
Yes.
you go, this is why these values work, look at all this wealth they've created.
Yes.
But that wealth itself, for the things that truly matter in eternity, end up being more of a curse than a blessing.
West is not best. And our brothers and sisters around the world who love Jesus and have a lot less mammon have so much to teach us.
Yes.
Yes, the West invented the individual, but it also invented individualism and expressive individualism and this atomization of culture. And oh my goodness, can we learn from our brothers and sisters around the world? Hello and welcome to Post-Christianity. I'm Glen Scrivener.
And I'm Andrew Wilson.
And this is our second episode, thinking about our historical moment here in the 21st century, but we want to see that in historical context and the ways in which we have been a Christianized society and now are a post-Christian society. Are we? Hence the question mark. In the last episode, we had a look at 1776, and Thomas Jefferson writes, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that we have these inviolable rights." And that wasn't originally what he said. Originally he said sacred and inviolable.
Sacred and undeniable.
Sacred and undeniable. Benjamin Franklin put a line through that and said, and one wonders whether it was just for aesthetic reasons or like he just thought it's better for concision to have a single word, self-evident.
Yeah, self-evident was a term that a lot of people at the time were beginning to use, and so it wasn't out of nowhere. I don't think it was just stylistic. I think there was an appeal to a sort of commonality of values that we share.
Yes.
I think when you say something is sacred, there's always an implication with the religious freedom hat on that maybe people who didn't share the same convictions about the sacred would disagree with the rights.
Yes.
And Franklin's obviously trying to outmaneuver that objection, I think, and say, no, this is self-evident, and we all affirm that it is.
Yes.
It's a funny phrase, though, because it says we hold these truths to be self-evident. Which, if it was actually self-evident, you wouldn't need to hold them at all. It would just, everyone knows it, and you probably wouldn't even need to say it.
But I think it makes sense. I think the entire sentence makes sense as long as you put all the emphasis on we. It's like,
yes.
Billions
Exactly.
wouldn't. Billions wouldn't, but we hold these truths to be self-evident, and we're going to have this experiment called America. Yeah. Let's give it a go. Who's all aboard on the American experiment? Yeah. Do you want to, live in this castle in the air in which we treat one another as though they have these unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And we said at the end of the last episode that helping people see that it's not self-evident, but that it has come to us through the contingency of history and theology is really helpful for Christians. It's always helpful for us to figure out whether what I believe has come from the Word of God or whether it's just come because I happen to live in the 21st century West. It's also helpful for our non-Christian friends to say, hey, the stuff that you count as self-evident, why don't we just call that a belief?
Yeah.
Because it's this gut intuition that you sort of navigate the world by. And what we're trying to do in this podcast is wake people up to the contingency of things, and underneath all the historical contingencies, there's Jesus Christ, who is working out his purposes in the world, and he has shaped all of us more than we might have imagined. What I really appreciated from your book, Remaking the World, Andrew, is that you press into the contingencies of history in the shaping of the West in a way that, my book, The Air We Breathe, it's a little bit more like Revelation 21, where the city just descends from on high. Right?
I never thought you compare yourself to the Apostle John in that early.
No, heaven. I am the New Jerusalem. But no, the Christianity is kind of like this, these Platonic ideals of equality, compassion, consent, enlightenment, science, freedom, and progress. And in a sense, my book is an ideas book with a bit of history along the way. And I sort of get people on board the train for the history journey by saying, hey, equality, that's quite a cool thing, and compassion. And I sort of map that onto historical developments, whereas you really dive down into 1776 and do the spade work on that. And so yours is a bit more like Matthew 13, okay? So, right?
Okay, I want to see where this is going.
That, the sower goes out and scatters seed, and there's some soil like this, some soil like this, some soil like this, and where is it going to come up? And it's a long, slow process with a lot of what you might feel is like utterly random contingency in these things. And in particular in your book, you point to the history of the West in terms of three things that are sort of absent from my book. And you talk about globalization, industrialization, and enrichment. as things that have developed and might have developed in totally different ways, depending on all sorts of contingent factors about geography and climate and those sorts of things. So why is it important to understand our cultural moment to figure out what is contingent historically?
I think it's very clever that you've done this through the metaphor of soils and seeds, because you basically make it sound like you are seeding things and I'm soiling things, which I'm not very happy about. I only realised as you were introducing it that way, I thought, this definitely makes me the bagger.
But your other chapters are more seedy.
Yeah, there's seeds as well. So I actually think it is a genuinely good metaphor.
Seedy. Your other chapters are more seedy.
There are the ideas, and then there's the land and the geography. And I think, before getting into any of the detail of that, not just in what I'm saying in the book, but the history of the West, I think it's important to see, because I'm just reminded of that scene in My Big Fat Greek Wedding where the dad is just continually saying, this famous thing, this is Greek, it's Greek. From the Greek, and everything seems to be, it's almost like if the Christians look like they're saying everything you value is simply from us,
right? Then
as much as
iPhones, you like your iPhone?
Yeah,
Christian.
It's Christian, exactly. And the thing is, a large part of that is true, as we'll see, and probably touched on the previous episode. But I think we have to also see that there's a whole load of what we might, as if you look at a Christian philosophy of history, you'd say these are providential contingencies. Ultimately, nothing is outside of. Right. I don't believe anything's outside of God's control or God's gift, but that there are all sorts of factors in terms of where oceans are and where minerals are and how fruitful land is and when it rains and all sorts of things like that, which actually, and what inventions take place where, and a lot of accidents of who meets whom and who finds which continent when, which they look like accidents to us. And I think they've actually been very instrumental in the forming of the modern West as well, and of the post-Christian world. And I think it's important to at least give recognition to that, even though most of the series we're going to talk more about what are the specifically Christian contributions and how they relate to post-Christianity. Understanding some of those contingencies, I think, is still critical, because otherwise you tell a very one-sided, ideas-based version, and you really only focus on the seed, not the soil. Yes. So I do like the metaphor as much as I think it puts me on a funny side of the line.
At one point in the globalization chapter, you begin with a quote by a Polynesian who found himself on, was it Captain Cook's ship?
Yeah.
Was he called Mahine?
Yeah, Mahine, yes.
Mahine, okay.
Yes, and my Polynesian isn't great, but it's an amazing story that they are sailing around the South Pacific, again, in the 1770s, trying to understand the peoples they meet, and they arrive at what we now call Easter Island, and they find that the people are, even though they look just like Mahine, who's from, now French Polynesia or Tahiti, that area, the people look just like that, but they are at a very different stage of development. In fact, they've got these very impressive statues, which are still very famous today. But the society now is incapable of building anything like the statues, which are almost mocking them, but going, "This is what your ancestors built, but you are much poorer than that now." And they're trying to make sense of this phenomenon. And this Mahine, this Polynesian man, says in his own language, "Good people, bad land." So basically, something's wrong with the land here that means that in the last 100-odd years, they begin to speculate maybe it's that there's been some ecological disaster, which has meant that people who used to be able to build these very impressive things now simply don't have the rainfall or the wood or the soil or whatever it is to be able to advance in that way. And I think it's a lovely little metaphor of what was going on more widely in the 18th century as the West was technologically advancing very quickly, which is that it's not just really about the people and the ideas and the things they said and what they believed or even the God they worshipped. It was a large part of it was to do with just the land. It's like, where are you? How much does it rain? What's under the ground? All those sorts of things. And I think it's quite a good parable for the relationship between ideas and material things in the development of the post-Christian world.
And you have inserted these 3 chapters in the rest of your book, and there's lots of stuff about the culture of Christianity and how it has shaped us and where we've gotten to. But you found it very important to focus in on these material elements, geography and climate and those sorts of things. Why is that so important as we do history?
Because I think you've got to understand that history is not simply the idea, the matter of one person coming up with a great new idea and people all believing it. And I think if you take that kind of view, you can end up with, to theologize it, a slightly Gnostic reading of the way history works. You end up going, it's simply all about spirit and idea, and it's not about matter and form and substance and things. And what can happen is, arrogance is one thing. You can say basically we had better ideas than everyone else. That's why we, and we have, at its worst, you end up with a very racist vision of the world, which is, well, of course, we've developed the ideas we have, and that's because we're just better thinkers than other people, and we can now impose those ideas on other nations, as of course people to this day in the West often still do. And we can say, you must believe these ideas we have because they've led to all of this wealth. And you just you overread your contribution to world history and underread the fact that no, a bunch of this is because you've got navigable rivers and they don't, or you have coal under your land and they don't, or you're that near the sea, or you get this amount of sunshine.
You've got a north-south orientation rather than east-west orientation to your continent.
You've got your local mammal is a sheep. Their local mammal is, in your case, a kangaroo or a wombat or a llama or
try domesticate that.
A rhinoceros. And you think, well, of course you're not going to be able to get farms built. And that it is.
I haven't milked a rhinoceros or a kangaroo. No,
no. Even a zebra, versus a horse. You try riding a zebra into battle. You try getting a zebra to pull your plow. It's not going to go well for you. And so I think at lots and lots of levels, it can take the legs out from the arrogance of Western thought often, which is effectively we've got great ideas and maybe a bit of Christianity mixed in with Greco-Roman tradition, and you have this sort of wonderfully advanced civilization. It's like, no, a big part of this has nothing to do with the ideas. It does, and we're going to talk about that as well. But it has a lot to do with minerals and weather and maths.
Yes. So one danger is it could all go towards spirit, and you just think it's all about great ideas that great people have, and that's the Gnostic kind of danger. There is the sort of just the Marxist danger as well of just going, it's all material explanations, isn't it? And tell me what that danger looks like.
So I think if you can also tell things almost as if there is a sense of inevitability, as if human agency doesn't really do anything. And I think to overplay that is to fail to see that there are parts of the world that are extremely geographically similar to one another, even almost geographically identical to one another, that have nevertheless developed in very different ways because the ideas, the institutions, the concepts, the theologies in those places are very different from one another. And there are some ideas that lead people, that go very deep in human beings, that cause us to change our motives and our ambitions and our desires in ways that we mustn't be underestimated. So it's not simply a product of material causes, because there are all sorts of ways in which, again, Christianity changes the way people think about what the future is and about the world is going to be better than it is, changes your view of the way of who God is and the fact that God is a consistent lawgiver who has structured the world to be understood, changes your view of what human beings are and how liable we are to be mistaken, and therefore changes our attitude towards innovation and what you might now call peer review, critiquing one another's ideas, changes your attitudes to exploration and discovery and ignorance, because it makes you realize how much you don't know, and therefore maybe we might go and find out. Change your attitude towards the past, so you don't venerate ancestors alone, but also realize that there are important ways in which they are flawed. So if your account of your ancestors looks like Genesis, you're going to conclude, okay, so human beings, our fathers have bequeathed to us these good things, but my goodness, what a tangled mess they were as well. It's like a soap opera.
Yes.
But if you don't have that, if you just have a hagiographic account of your ancestors, you will over-venerate their wisdom and under-recognize the contribution that every generation is called to make to discover things that might be improved upon. And you put all of that together and shake it around, and you will end up with a group of people, as the modern West has, at its best, has been, that are convinced that there is more to be discovered, more to be found, and a value in testing and experimenting and pursuing novelty, not just preserving fidelity.
Right.
And then you put that in a mixture with the geographical factors I've talked about, and you end up with something like the enrichment industrial revolution that we have benefited from and are still podcasting using the fruits of right now.
Yes, because otherwise you feel like history is just the onward march of inevitable ideas or great men.
Yes.
Great, and maybe...
Well, not inevitable ideas. In some ways, you see it as the onward march of ideas, and a new idea can, like a meme, can just instantly sweep all before it. And the reality is, I don't think that is the case. I think that most of the ideas we're talking about are only able to get any traction because they are accompanied by inventions or matter. The idea and matter. Effectively, it's like it's word and flesh, right? It's sort of coming together of both of those things. And I think we are at risk of almost having a slightly Gnostic reading of history if you're not careful, where the only thing that matters is it is the spirit that gives life, and the flesh has no value at all. which of course in Paul's terms is true, but when you read history that way, you end up saying, actually, an idea, we can almost over-imagine how important, the discourse about a particular bill or law or tweet or whatever it might be is, and thinking this has got the power to change everything.
Yeah.
And that can create quite a lot of anxiety because individuals think, actually, my rightly thinking or saying the exact right word here has the power to change everything. So it's not just a problem with our reading of the past,
right,
but actually our understanding of our own place in the world. We basically get messiah complexes for the significant people, particularly people like you and me who speak and write for a living, and many people listening to this probably very interested in ideas. That's why you're here. But the risk is that you can exaggerate too much the importance of those things without seeing the sort of wider social, familial, industrial, geographical even factors that lead it to have succeeded or panned out the way it did.
Yes. You are not all that. You are not the driver of history. And I think we're already used to thinking that when it comes to the first century. I think a lot of people are used to thinking, well, why did Christ come at the year dot? Well, the Pax Romana was a great help for the gospel to spread and the lingua franca of Greek was really helpful to have this, and there were all sorts of confluences of historical contingencies that, now that you look back on it, you say, well, obviously, it sort of had to be there, and so we have this sense of God sort of superintending.
The Book of Acts 100 years earlier would be like, well, and then they got on a ship, and then they got mugged by pirates. The end. It's just like the whole thing was Right. So you're right. We are used to reading a lot of historical, and similarly the Reformation, printing, Luther. So we make those connections, but in our own day we can underestimate them. At least insofar as it means creating the things that make the post-Christian West distinctive.
Yes.
And so as you say, a number of things I do in the book to try and bring those back into the discussion, so that you can see how the ideas and the material developments interact with each other.
Precisely because in our day, there are lots of people wanting to stand up for the West and standing up for Western values that make me quite uneasy.
Yes.
And saying things like West is best and trying to, and not giving particularly spiritual answers to why the West has had the dominance that it's had. And if you don't have a doctrine of the Spirit, all you're left with is the flesh. So at what point does that become kind of white supremacy? At what point does that become a real colonial kind of problem?
Yeah.
And you push back against that hard by talking about just what are some of the sort of utterly contingent aspects of Western Europe?
So I think one of the things I had in mind was I think it was Dinesh D'Souza. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce his name, where he had this. He's obviously become a bit of an online polemicist for a particular way of seeing the West, and a staunch defender. Like you said, he doesn't. I'm not sure if he ever says West is best, but that's the vibe you get from the book. And he's saying, so when did you last read a great Zulu novel, or words to that effect? And I was like, man, this is as if there is something in the. Now he wouldn't say it's a racial essentialist project. He's not at all. But what he is saying is the ideals and ideas contained within Christianity, when mingled with Greco-Roman society, produce this unique thing, which has actually been uniquely fruitful at an ideological level, and therefore you can actually have a sort of sense of cultural supremacy. And I hope I'm not being unduly unfair on the way he presents the argument, but I just recoiled from it, because I think it is to completely underestimate the fact that a major part of the reason why the island we're sitting on right now, and Great Britain has had the outsized impact it has, is because of all sorts of things that are essentially to do with even with geography. So forget inventions and forget developments even of ideas and the church and all that, and just say, well, it's partly because of where it is.
Or the Gulf Stream,
the Gulf weather system. Exactly. If we had the weather that you had on the opposite side of the Atlantic, we would be 15 degrees colder. You wouldn't be able to grow anything. So all sorts of things like that, but at a global level, the idea that you are in Eurasia, if you look at the sort of the major land masses, you say, well, you've got Afro-Eurasia is one uninterrupted block of land, and obviously the vast majority of the world's people live there. And then you've got the Americas, which existed in almost isolation from Afro-Eurasia until 600 years ago, 500 years ago. And then you've got Australia, which, again, similarly existed in splendid isolation for even longer. And so you end up with the idea that most of the people live in one place. That when people eventually develop things like farming, and then eventually cities and the like, and writing and all the things that come with it, which enable us to, developmentally to do all the things we're able to do now, including podcasting about stuff, that those things are as a result of being in the right set of continents, and also to being in the part of the continent that has been settled by those people who developed farming early, which was primarily in West Asia and Eastern China. And so basically, if you were going to get, quote, civilization emerging anywhere, and all you had was a relief map and a bit of common sense, you would say, well, that's probably going to emerge either in the Fertile Crescent in West Asia, where the land of the Bible and Babylon, Assyria, and so on, or in between the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers in China, or both. And it was both. And then, of course, you get pockets of it elsewhere. But those two societies develop much quicker and have population explosions much quicker. And then, of course, you find other pockets in, obviously in India and in parts of Africa and in both North and South America. But those two population cores are predominant, which is why there are so many essentially Semitic descended and ancient Near Eastern descended peoples, and so many Chinese descended peoples in the world today. They got a huge head start for geographical reasons. And if you don't see that, and you don't realize that that's actually a big part of why, so I'm not just going back to, hey, the British Empire had machinery, and that I'm saying, no, look back 10,000 years and you'll see that a lot of the reason why we have some of the developments that were enabling us to have this conversation goes back a very, very long time to things that really didn't have anything to do with the ideas people were talking about.
Right.
In some ways, that's the reason why the ideas that people in those communities came to believe or receive were ever heard about by anyone else, is because of some geographical and then eventually technological advantages they had, not because of the ideas themselves.
Right. Where do ideas come in, though? Because, like, I completely get, Australians are justly proud of the great southern land, and we call it the lucky country. But actually, the soil is terrible, and there aren't great rivers, and it's mainly desert.
Yeah. And your animals are a problem too, right? How are you going to domesticate animals?
You can't domesticate them.
So we're going to farm kangaroos and all that. I mean, what are you going to do?
And so, I mean, North America had a bit of a head start on Australia in terms of settlement. And yet North America, 330 million, is it? Australia, 25 million, And like the land makes a big difference in lots of ways. But then you could compare North America to South America, as someone like Niall Ferguson does.
Yes.
And he says, well, that is an interesting experiment in running a kind of a Protestant North versus a Catholic South. And it's not that the South has worse geography or land or riches, resources. You can dig silver out of the mines in Argentina and all the rest of it. And so at some point, would you say ideas do come in?
Oh, they absolutely do. So ideas come in, throughout the process. It's never like, well, it's now matter, and then suddenly idea. It's not like that at all, of course.
Yep.
Although actually, even in the example Ferguson gives, and he does a lot of work on it in his books, but I think even then, the idea that there is, as a lot of development economists talk about, the resource curse, or words to that effect, that actually sometimes having a land in which it's too easy to get wealth out of the ground doesn't incentivize the sorts of institutions and developments that. So in North America, people are having to hunker down for winter after winter and farm and just scrape by. And actually, of course, you could never set up an encomienda system that they did in South America, in North America, because it's just not bountiful enough. Whereas in the South, and of course, and the other classic example is the resources of Africa, that actually the parts of Africa that have struggled in poverty for a long time, in large part because the ground is so abundant. And even to this day, the sort of minerals you can take out of parts of the DRC or whatever are so valuable that actually they come in and they raid. And that actually there's almost even then a disadvantage to having too much abundance in the land. But anyway, by the by, obviously there's always an interaction between the two. And you can see two societies with roughly similar geographies, which develop in very different ways because of the idea. So I'd be the last person to deny that happens. Yeah. But I think generally Western people are more inclined to see the ideas as mattering more than the geographical or the territorial or the mineral or technological factors underneath it. And so I think I wanted to talk about the way that both interplay with each other. And actually, when a great breakthrough, so again, in the year I've given a lot of time to, 1776, you have Adam Smith writing this great economics textbook about how people get rich. But in the end, Adam Smith has no idea that the West is about to explode in wealth. And in fact, he's trying to explain why wealth is not growing as it ought to be, because he thinks people aren't doing the right things. So his ideas are speaking at the sort of, we still study in universities today, very important ideas, but actually what ends up giving the massive breakthrough in wealth is ultimately things to do with minerals and technology, which end up causing wealth to explode in Northern Europe and very quickly elsewhere as well. So I think even in those great examples, we have a brilliant economist speaking at the cusp of modernity. He doesn't actually have any idea what's about to happen in his own generation, and that will come about because of stuff rather than, it's maps, not chaps, is the phrase people often use, and I think rightly so.
Yes. In the Eurasian continent, though, supercontinent, we've got very fertile areas of China and very fertile areas in what is now Europe. But you do make a comparison at one stage between the sorts of journeys, the sorts of journeys that people embark on from China in exploring the world. But do they explore the world as opposed to the ships that are going from Britain, named things like the Endeavour and Explorer and all those sorts of things? So there are sort of theological differences that are going on.
There are, yes. And so I think that's why I think ideas, you have to factor in the role of worldviews and ambition and purpose into these, that teleology, not just matter. And I think the ships one is a really interesting one because there's I still find it in Waterstones or regular bookshops, this book about what would have happened if the Chinese actually did discover America in 1490 something, these sorts of books which are giving these thought experiments. But actually the Chinese were way ahead of the West in the 15th century and had these enormous, one of the statistics, I like it, they had these massive ships. So they said that although they're sailing at roughly the same time as Christopher Columbus, in fact, 80 odd years before, that Columbus's ship is the same size as one of the Chinese ship's rudder. So it's just vastly disproportionate. And you think, wow, they were way ahead technologically. But there is the idea factor is in there as well. And so what happens is the Chinese treasure ships, and there's a lot of writing about this and still disagreement about exactly what the agenda was, but there was a lot of collecting tribute, there was some settling, there was some taking back curiosities, but the motive wasn't, we're now going to go and discover how big the world is, or we're now going to go and try and find new lands and new peoples, and we're not. Whereas when Captain Cook eventually sailing in the 18th century, and again in 1776, the motives for his trips are things like, we want to find out if the Northwest Passage can actually be reached from this side of the ocean, or we want to find out what's the transit of Venus, and so we're studying it, and we sent a mission out there 8 years ago and it went wrong. And if we don't get it this year, then Venus won't do it again for another N years, so we better go out now and take all our measurement equipment. Oh, and while we're there, let's pop in on Tahiti and New Zealand. Oh gosh, goodness, I didn't know the Maori.
And take tens of thousands of botanical specimens.
Massive experiments. So Botany Bay, where I imagine not a million miles away from where you come from, and all these, they're all these sort of, Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander and all these other scientists going out saying, we want to discover. And they did. They named their ships things like Resolution and Adventure and Endeavour and Discovery because they're trying to find out about the world. Now, I don't want to be naive and say, oh, that's the only thing they were doing, because obviously there's some flag planting and some resource extraction as well. But I think quite genuinely you can see a motive in many of these people that is trying to find out more about the world at an intellectual level. Meanwhile, when they eventually head to the Chinese court and try and establish trade in the early 1790s, the Chinese emperor famously says, I've still heard in the last few years, I heard Chinese diplomats quote it on the radio because it's still quite a notorious thing. He said, the Chinese emperor said, well, strange and costly exotic objects don't interest me. We've got everything we need here. Right. And actually the contrast was pretty strong that the ideas that led Western people to go all over the world to pick stuff up were grounded in a sense that was ultimately a theological one, that there were things that you could discover and improve about the world and learn more and retrieve and connect the world more together and perhaps eventually share the gospel with people and so on. Now that's half the story. There's a terrible history that we would, I expect, know well as well. But I do think it's fair to say that a large part of why Western people went where they went was not just because they had greater resources, often they didn't, but because there were ideas motivating those trips as well. And
in those senses, there are ideas about progress and the arrow of time, the direction of history that we can explore and improve. Which is sort of one sort of perhaps theological difference Tom Holland spends a lot of time when he talks about science and the emergence of science, pressing into how far advanced the Chinese were when it came to astronomy. And their instruments were so much better, and there were all sorts of people from the West, going out and learning from the Chinese about that. Yeah. But in the end, the scientific breakthroughs that certainly we consider to be what the scientific revolution sort of began with, had some theological underpinnings to them. Things like a single God who could be trusted, at all times and in all places, in the cosmos, a contingent universe that might be otherwise, and therefore you better go out and test it. Things like a doctrine of humanity that says people are fallen and that actually their minds are kind of the seat of their rebellion, and we are self-justifying fools that need things that end up becoming peer review and trying to disconfirm your hypothesis and things like that. And I think there might be another example where incredibly clever people with incredibly sophisticated technology that in some senses was outstripping the West, hit a kind of a filter in which Christian assumptions and presuppositions went through the filter and others didn't.
Yes, and I think if you would, even the way Chinese education at the time, and might to some degree probably still true, but certainly at the time there was reflecting backwards on the annals and the great works of Confucius and other sort of founding fathers, which of course in Europe you have that too, people looking back to scripture, but it's extraordinary. You get these guys beginning to write books like Everything Aristotle Ever Said Was Wrong, and Why Aristotle's the Stupidest of All Philosophers, was that Galileo called him that? I mean, these remarkable statements. Yeah. And the equivalent of Aristotle in the East would be Confucius, but people weren't saying those things. No. And as I say, to some degree still don't, because the way in which, what's normal in most societies is that you look back to tried and tested ancestral wisdom. Yep. What's unusual about the Christian West, effectively, is people began to say, there is lots of stuff we don't know, and there's lots of limitations to our knowledge, and there's plenty of huge blind spots. And wow, that continent we didn't even know was there, and now look at all these people and look at all this land. And it's that sense of ignorance that ends up power and an eschatology that in the end God is going to make the world better than it is now.
Yes,
that powers a sense that yes, society can go forwards. It's not simply, as many Greeks believed, you had the Golden Age, then the Silver Age, then the Bronze Age, and we're now here in the Iron Age or whatever. Right. You think, no, that's a sort of downward trajectory, or perhaps the Stoics, a cyclical journey where you just go round and round and, cycle, death, rebirth, which if you just looked at nature is probably what you would conclude.
Yes.
Summer down to winter and then back to summer again, Whereas in Christianity you get, no, the world can get better, we can advance, we can learn more. Yes. And knowledge that we have held treasure for 1,000 years might well turn out to be total bunk. And so we need to be prepared to test it. And so those assumptions percolating through a society for long enough do affect. So I do think the ideological part is very important. The material part is very important. And it's the interplay between the two that creates the conditions for what we now call modernity.
And that really feeds into the enrichment story, which, you mentioned Adam Smith writing in 1776 on The Wealth of Nations. He is describing sort of what has come to be known as capitalism, but he did not recognize that he was living through a time when the resources of a culture would far outstrip,
Well, he's writing the book. He publishes the book the day after James Watt's steam engine starts work in Bloomfield Colliery. Like the next is...
It's a significant date, 1776.
Yeah, it is. Well, you should write a book about it. The 8th and 9th of March. It is remarkable because, again, he just doesn't realize, these enormous technological changes that are happening at the same time. Yeah. He doesn't see their significance, at least.
And that's when the hockey stick graphs begin. And if you read someone like a Steven Pinker, he will publish dozens and dozens and dozens of such charts that talk about, the
world's getting better.
The world's getting better. And help us to see the ways in which the contingency of, a rich supply of coal quite close to the surface in northern England maps onto that sort of the curiosity and the sense of novelty and the sense of progress and the theological beliefs that people have. How are they interplaying in this moment?
So I think you particularly would look at it through I did, and I think you can look at it through the lens of the Industrial Revolution, what we now call. So you would say, okay, across if you look at deep history, people have basically lived on, somewhere around $400 to $500 a year in modern terms for almost all of human history. What happens is, you think that's crazy. People are always inventing things and therefore getting more wealth, which they are. It's just that they're using that wealth to ensure that more of their children survive. And so the GDP per head goes down. So a new discovery is made, people get a bit richer, but it means more of their children survive, so they then go back to being a bit poorer. And that cycle, occasionally you get a cataclysm like bubonic plague or a massive hurricane or something, and a lot of people die, and then the standard of living quickly goes up, but then they have more children and it goes down. And that was called the Malthusian trap and existed for pretty much all of history. I think I was astonished to discover that the standard of living per person in Shakespeare's day was almost exactly what it was in King David's day.
Right, yeah.
Per person, and globally. Now, obviously, there are rich people and poor people, but because that's just what we do. We end up saying, I'm going to invest this and giving my kids a better chance, and so we have more of them. What is unusual is that in the late 18th century, that ceiling gets punched through for the first time, and obviously does look like a hockey stick. It's just flat. GDP per head is largely flat for all human history until 250 years ago, and suddenly turns a corner and explodes up, and obviously is still screaming upwards at a global level. And there are all kinds of reasons for that, which obviously I talk a lot about in the book. But I think a fascinating window into it is through the British Industrial Revolution, where you have a lot of material requirements that you do have a lot of coal, minerals, you've got plenty of water. It's quite a small island. Things are connected together relatively well. It's easier to link the whole nation together than it is in plenty of other countries or whatever. There's a relatively predictable seasonal pattern, which means that the rains come at roughly the same time. So it's not like an El Nino thing or a monsoon, but you've actually got a fairly steady. You've also got many centuries of wealth through the wool trade, and it's linked. It's near enough to a landmass to be able to trade, and all sorts of things like that, which vary. But you also have very strong sort of Christian roots to even the explosion of wealth we had through the influence, particularly in Protestants and dissenters, nonconformists. So this is obviously an Anglican speaking to a nonconformist, but the nonconformists contributed a disproportionate amount, it would seem, in this period to science and technology, partly because they were excluded from other things they might be able to do in society.
Couldn't go to university, for instance.
And couldn't take clerical office. There'd be all sorts of things that they couldn't do in the nobility and in the senior hierarchy of the nation. So they formed businesses, and a lot of them were dissenters, and some of them heretically so as well, but ended up investing a lot of time and energy into discovery and building businesses. But you also had, through partly the influence of Protestantism, a very strong sense of connection between people who make things and people who think things. So this lovely line from Dr. Johnson, Samuel Johnson, who says, we are a city of philosophers, and we make the boobies of Birmingham work for us with their hands. Basically, we are, which meant as in these dolts who just do all the work, but we are thinkers. But what happens in Britain is you increasingly, through the influence of Protestant thinkers and people like Francis Bacon and others, we need to bring together the people who make things and the people who think things, and use science and experimentation in a feedback loop in on themselves. Protestantism also makes people more literate because they believe the word of God is given them in a book. And if you end up with a highly literate society in which people exchange and argue about sectarian ideas a lot because of, again, partly the influence of Protestantism, if you have a relatively low level of religious persecution because the state is not able to suppress all the ideas at once, and there's been lots of back and forth about what state religion will be, and you put that in a context where you've got lots of individuals who are making, experimenting, testing ideas and arguing about them, you have the intellectual conditions as well as the material ones for something like the Industrial Revolution to happen, which of course it does. And that's not only in Britain, there's much of it happens elsewhere, but you would look from the history of the world and say, wow, something happened in late 18th century Britain that didn't happen elsewhere until that point. And it seems to have quite a lot to do with Christian ideas mingled in with a whole load of material factors that other nations didn't have.
And things like work and wealth. In classical thoughts, the last, one of the things out of Pandora's box was work, right? This cursed thing. And so like a view of the dignity of work, that the boobies of Birmingham actually have.
They're doing good things.
Are doing good things and wealth as well, in terms of like a classical thing to do with wealth. If you ever got any excess, which was very rarely, you would either hoard it or display it.
Yeah.
And what happens in a culture where you're continually told stories of, if you have any talents, don't put them in the ground. Like invest. There is a kind of a...
Well, this is what Weber said, and he's, and everybody who studies sort of sociology or even like economics of the West has to read him, and there's plenty that you would correct about what he said, but I think there's central insight that that different value systems have different levels of weight placed on the value of manual work and of experimental thinking and of pioneering novelty.
Yep.
And if you have people who really think novelty is generally a good thing, or at least to try, coupled with people who are prepared to say working very hard and reinvesting your money is a good thing, you do have the intellectual, ideological conditions match with. But of course, had that happened somewhere completely different, there still wouldn't. If you didn't have coal, you didn't have the coal, didn't have iron, you wouldn't have been able to do it either. But the double whammy seems to be what made. I was going to say Britain special. That sounds. I definitely don't want to go there.
Makes Britain great.
But I do think it's worth. Obviously you've got to be careful how you tell the story, that it's not triumphalist. But I think at the level of studying historical causes, seeing those two things working in concert in the case of Britain. Is really so. Rather than saying this is just because there's something innately better about anybody who lives in the West, or there's anything better even about the ideas they had, but the collision of those ideas, particularly the Christian originated and novelty favouring ones, coupled together with sort of the material conditions they had, were extremely important in generating what we now think of as the modern world.
Yes, and so beliefs to some degree affect the enrichment of the West, which has had an incredible impact on how we consider ourselves and life and meaning and purpose. But riches also have an incredible impact on our beliefs.
They do.
As well. So how should we think about, as incredibly enriched Westerners in the church, it's also a curse, isn't it?
It is.
To have mammon so front and center,
how hard
so
is it
easily
for a rich
available
man to enter the kingdom of God?
Yeah. So what impacts has that had on what we take for granted, what we think of as self-evident?
Yes.
Is yes, there's a Christian heritage, but it's also the fact that we've got a supercomputer in our pockets that delivers to us, all the music in the world for free. How are we meant to reflect on that contingency?
So, how to reflect on the contingency, I think that's a huge question. I'm not even. I think you, at the very least, you can say this has both been good and bad. But I think in what ways it's good and bad is a long discussion. But I think this is one of the examples that wealth is one of the examples of how, I think in the previous episode you quoted Peter Berger, Christianity's been its own gravedigger. And that might be true just at an ideas level, but it's also true at a financial, economic level, because what Christianity has done, it would seem in Northwest Europe initially and then spreading very quickly to all over the world, is to generate conditions of prosperity that in the end make it harder to hold to Christian faith. And I imagine you're asking about the second half of that. Like, how do those conditions, we've talked about the first bit, how do those conditions make it harder to be Christian? One of the things they do is they make people have much smaller families, which is, interestingly, you got 2 children, I've got 3 children. If we lived 500 years ago, we would have had more and would have lost more. And actually, we're not small families. There's many people who would have fewer kids than that. And that at a social level, there are all sorts of fascinating connections between how many children people have and how religious they are, which map not just through history, but all across the world today, which is one of the reasons Christianity is, booming in sub-Saharan Africa and is stagnating in the West, and even in countries that are not ideologically very Western, like somewhere like Japan or South Korea. So that's one of the things that was when people get richer, it seems for whatever reason, the causality is not always obvious. They have fewer kids. They invest more resources in fewer children. I think there is also a deeper theological thing that you can go way back to Jesus with the rich young ruler. It's obvious comment, but how hard is it for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God? It does seem that people's willingness to trust in something other than God obviously goes up when they have more money because they've got more things they could trust in, whereas someone with very little says, I've got to throw all my hope on God. Yeah. And you find that coming through in the pastoral epistles in 1 Timothy 5 and 6. You find it in Proverbs even. Lord, I don't want too much money or too little money, because if I'm too little money, I might go here. But if I got too much, I will forget you. I'll trust in myself. And so there's quite a basic idolatry of mammon that the Western world has supercharged. It's always been there, but obviously by lifting up the god of mammon, the god of money or possessions, it makes Christianity gradually seem less plausible in a society, even though that wealth is itself, as we've been saying, in significant part, a product of Christian influence.
Yes.
So it's one of those, and there's various iterations of this that we may even touch on in other episodes, but Christianity has produced conditions that have then ended up making Christianity harder.
Right.
It's been hoisted by its own petard, or we have been hoisted by our own petard in a way.
Yeah.
And I think that is how, your bigger question, I don't know the answer to. How should we think providentially about God's purposes in allowing that to happen?
Mm-hmm.
Acceptance, I mean, you might have some interesting comments. The only thing that occurs to me is simply to say we need to be very aware of not boasting in the things that we are inclined to see as great achievements of our society.
Right, yeah.
Which, of course, is often the very first thing people do, saying, here
Yes.
you go, this is why these values work, look at all this wealth they've created.
Yes.
And you say, yeah, but that wealth itself may end up, for the things that truly matter in eternity,
Yes.
end up being more of a curse than a blessing, even as they are doing many very good things, like making people live in less pain and increasing people's likelihood of being able to feed their families and so on. Yeah. There is a dark side to it.
Yes.
Don't get carried away with yourselves and believe your own PR.
Yeah. What do you have that you were not given?
Yeah.
In that 1 Corinthians 4 sort of sense. And also maybe it sort of brings us full circle to this acknowledgement that West is not best. And our brothers and sisters around the world who love Jesus and have a lot less mammon have so much to teach us.
Yes.
They have so much to teach us in terms of, we have gotten distorted in terms of, yes, the West invented the individual, but it also invented individualism and expressive individualism and this atomization of culture. And oh my goodness, can we learn from our brothers and sisters around the world? And can we learn from our brothers and sisters around the world who do not have mammon to rely on and yet trust in Jesus in ways that are so good for our souls? And so I think that really helps us to, who knows, in all the providential things that God is doing, with the bless stroke curse that money is, it should make us look beyond ourselves.
Yes.
To those, who realize, it's only when Jesus is all I have that I realize that Jesus is all I need. Yeah. And that's, that's the lesson for us all, I think.
It is.
That'll do for this episode, won't it?
It's kind of a profound and sobering conclusion that should cut off triumphalism at the knees, but to recognize that, to be thankful for what we have been given, but to recognize the grave dangers in trusting in any gift. Yeah. And certainly that of material prosperity.
And let's have a global perspective on the growth of Christianity around the world. By the end of this decade, it seems like there'll be more Christians in China than there are in the United States. And look around sub-Saharan Africa, look at Afghanistan, look at Iran. There is the flip side to the fact that mammon can be a curse, that's in places that don't have so much. The gospel is going great guns.
It is.
Well, that is episode 2 of Post-Christianity, ? This is a podcast of the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics, which is a ministry of the Gospel Coalition. But Andrew Wilson, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.